Good morning.
Good morning.
So after the Q&A last time, during the Q&A, after the talk last time, we had this kind of discussion about the sort of vast theory about Buddha nature and the world and how it all worked and causal conditions and things like that. So this Mahayana model of how this is. And, I was talking about wisdom in Inmo, the fascicle Inmo from Shobogenzo, and how Dogen understood, or how Mahayana understands wisdom. And that is foundational and not different from suchness being another name for wisdom. But the thing about it is I think that maybe what I didn't make very clear was that delusion is part of Buddha nature. Okay, delusion is part of suchness, and also that Buddha nature is non-conceptual. So that's what I want to talk about today. So the talk is maybe a little technical, but I'm sure you can all bear with me on this because this is an important point to understand. So, and the other thing is that I use the expression basic goodness from Trungpa Rinpoche, which also seemed to create some kind of confusion around Buddha nature being basic goodness in relationship to how delusion fits into that. So some people were thinking that if we said, basic goodness, then good couldn't be part of, good was part of suchness, but delusion couldn't be part of that. So that's not correct. And so I wanted to talk about kind of the logic of that. So first of all, Buddha nature is a name for a process. So it's not a thing per se, it's like a process. So Dogen calls this the world, worlding the world. And it means that everything is impermanent, no inherently existing, not inherently existing, or we say about the self, our sense of self, we are no inherently existing self, right? So we are subject to all of this as well. Everything is causally related. Everything is interconnected. Everything is interbeing with everything else. To the point of, in the Huayan, they talk about things being interpenetrating, which means that we actually, on a cellular level, we are changed by other things, right? We are incorporate them into our body. And so, all of this happening together, that's impermanence. Permanence is just a way of talking about this process. And then I'll just say karma, the word karma just means action. That's all it means. So it's karma is talking about all of this kind of stuff that's going on and the results that may come out of all of these causal conditions interacting with each other. So what do we have from a Zen point of view? We say everything is arising and falling. In Zen, we say things are just coming and going. We talk about birth and death. All right. So those are also words in Zen to talk about this. This is another meaning for the word emptiness, for what we say the doctrine of emptiness is also, all of these things is also emptiness. So things are empty of inherent existence. It means that they are affected by causal conditions. They are affected by coming and going. There's birth and death. There's all this interaction going on. This is a process that's happening. All of life, everything, Buddha nature itself, emptiness, whatever you want to call it, suchness, all of this is talking about life as process, right? All this interrelating process. So emptiness, we use the word emptiness, we say empty of this, empty of that, not this, not that. That kind of language is an attempt to get us away from conceptualizing things as kind of concretized conceptualization of something. Something is this, something is that. It's always this, it's always that. So if we say, no, it's empty of inherent existence, or an earlier phrase in English was no thing, which is problematic because that's very nihilistic to say nothing, because no thing we think of as being nothing, right? But that's not what emptiness is. Emptiness is a description of absolutely everything. So you can talk about it empty of inherent existence, and that's going to be a very not this, not that kind of language. Or you can talk about it in a positive way, which we would say Buddha nature, suchness, tathagata, those kind of words are more positive, but are more easily thought of as being something, right? But we're not talking about something, an unchanging something. We're talking about this process that's happening from this Buddhist point of view. Okay, so that means that we also say things just as they are. Everything's part of this process. Good is part of what we call good is part of a process. What we call bad is part of a process. What we call delusion is part of the process. What we call enlightenment is part of the process. It's all in there, but really it's just this thing happening, this world in the world, as Dogen says. So again, everything's impermanent. Nothing has inherent existing self. And so this no inherently existing self is not just about talking about person as self, but talking about things as self, because in Mahayana Buddhism, things, right, are sentient. They have a sentiency to them. So, so again, everything is causally related, interconnected, inner being. And this is this karma that's happening. So delusion, all delusion is not understanding this interconnected process, right? So delusion would be that you don't understand that this interconnection is a core essence of our life. It's the core essence of the world. And when we're in delusion, we don't understand that. So we do things that are harmful. We do things that are not skillful at any given time because we don't understand that. So delusion just means not being in accord with Buddha nature, not being in accord with what already is, not being in accord with what you already are. That's why we say, Dogen said, all beings are Buddha nature. So we are this, right? We're not outside. We're not outside the world's functioning, are we, as human beings? Or we're not like from some other, even if we were from another universe, every universe that we know also functions under these same kinds of conditions. So human beings are not outside of that. So it means that we too are subject to all of these things. And this is just how the world's process works. And that's what Buddha nature is. So we are not outside that. We cannot be outside of that. So, so we're all manifesting Buddha nature. Now, there's Buddha nature and then there's Buddhahood, right? So there's Buddha nature is things just as they are, the world, worlding the world, sun coming up, whatever it is. Then there's Buddhahood. Buddhahood is where we actually manifest Buddha nature. So we may not be manifesting our understanding, but when we're manifesting our understanding, then we are manifesting Buddha nature. We are manifesting our Buddha-ness, if you will. But that doesn't mean we're still it doesn't mean that we're no longer Buddha nature. It just means that we're either manifesting or we're not manifesting it. And so delusion is not manifesting it. So we can never be outside this. Whatever we do is not outside this process that in Mahayana Buddhism we're calling Buddha nature. So if a person is engaged in violence, let's say, antisocial behavior, maybe we would say what they're doing is, from a Buddhist point of view, say, well, they have an attachment to self. And that attachment to self is not inclusive of other beings. They're not aware of their interconnection. They're not aware of all of this processing and causal conditionings and all of the things that go in to relationships, they think they have an inherently existing self that has nothing to do with anybody else. And so they're just going on and doing whatever they're doing. So that's that's an anti-social behavior, not taking other people into account, not engaging in cooperative relationships with each other. And so we say, you're caught in delusion. So in a society, when someone is really being antisocial and doing things that are quite harmful, like robbing people or killing people or whatever it might be, then we, put fences around them. And we say, you can't do this anymore. So essentially, we're going to put a fence around you or put you in prison or whatever it is. But the thing about that too is that we're doing that to try to get this person to stop creating harm because they don't understand that this is delusional behavior. But then how do we do that, right? Is that done in a punitive way? Is that done in a way that has a kind of sanity to it, where we realize that they too are part of this Buddha nature, that they, because they are also Buddhists, they also deserve a kind of intrinsic respect. So how do we treat that person? Are we treating them from the position of delusion? Or are we treating them from the position of wisdom and enlightenment, or manifesting Buddha nature? So, that becomes a question too, like what kind of fence do we build? And how do we engage in this way? So do we know that we're karmically linked? Do we know that we are a no and inherently existing self in relationship to this other person? Do we know and acknowledge that this person has Buddha nature? So if we do that, then the fence that we build is going to be humane and it's going to be wise. Otherwise, we're going to build a fence that's harmful and punitive, because we're going to be driven by our negative emotions and get carried away. Okay, so this person who does not understand the nature of this process of the world, worldling the world, again, is not mean that we are separate from it. It just means that we're out of step with it. We are not in accord with things just as they are. So we don't understand. We can't see our greed. We can't see our delusion. We can't see our anger or hate, for example, as being problematic. Dogen says, I think he's in Genjo Koan, he says something akin to those who are manifesting Buddhahood realize that they can see delusion. Buddhas can see delusion, their own delusion. So one of the parts of our practice is waking up and seeing our delusion. So we have, these practices that we do. And so as we see what our delusion is, and inevitably what we're seeing is that we're not in sync with Buddha nature. We're not in sync with what we already are. So that's in Inmo, he talks about how we seek. Remember the wisdom seeking wisdom? This wisdom seeking wisdom is our Buddha nature, our inherent existence of Buddha nature, this isness seeking itself, essentially, seeking and wanting to see itself. So again, delusion is not outside this, it is separate. It is not outside this and separate, it is part of Buddha nature. So the precepts, there are a couple of precepts that are difficult precepts, like for example, not killing. So you might say, well, how can I, how does that precept kind of work with Buddha nature? Well, the thing about the precept is of not killing, for example, is we cannot possibly function without killing. We're either directly or indirectly killing because we have to eat. but everything else in the world is also engaged in directly or indirectly killing. So this is to think about not killing in that regard, I would say, is a delusional or misunderstanding about the nature of the precept. Because the precept, if you think about it in relationship to interconnection, impermanence, birth and death, causal relationships, when you think about it in that way, and you think about the totality of everything being a process, then that process includes this cycle of killing. But the question is this killing being done in a way that is harmful in the sense that it does not recognize our relationships with each other, all beings related to each other in this very intimate way. So we're attracted to, like Native Americans who say to the animal, excuse me, I respect you, I'm going to kill you so I can eat you, and I'm going to use all the parts of this animal because I respect this animal, and realize that it's nourishing me, and I thank them for doing that. So that's a way to acknowledge this interconnection that we have with each other, because as human beings, I don't know what tigers think. I don't, I think about predators. I don't know what bugs are thinking about, or any other creature, but I do know as human beings, we think about this kind of stuff. And so the more that we acknowledge this and pay attention to this, the more it wakes us up and creates a mind, and opens up and creates and brings forth our Buddha mind, which is already there for us to access if we can access it. So same thing for something like a precept like stealing. Like, for example, I'm sure everybody can think of an example where you might steal. You're super hungry. There's nobody around. There's something there to eat. You can't ask anybody whether or not you can eat it, so you eat it. Or I can even think of times you may take something that isn't given, in the sense of taking something because you are starving. And even if that person might not want to give it to you. But the question, I'm not thinking about this in the sense of engaging in violence to get something, but I don't know. I'm some example of, like, there's a pie on a windowsill, and maybe, it's like that person would not give it to you if you ask them, but it's there, you're starving, whatever. Maybe this isn't a very good example, but you can, if you thought about it, you can come up with examples that would make sense. So there are times when the precepts, which are not like tablets brought down from the mountains, the precepts are in some ways situational. There are, in the case of not killing, in the case of not stealing, there are going to be situations in which you could see how that would be appropriate to engage in those. Some of the other precepts are like, for example, not misusing sexuality, I think, is pretty clear, and I can't think of a way in which you would misuse sex. When you say misuse, I think it's really clear. If you said something like "don't misuse killing," that would be an interesting thing that is not part of that precept, but it might be an interesting thing to add that. Don't misuse stealing, which I think maybe the reason that it's not there is because if you say that, it's kind of like, well, maybe you could do that, but so we're wily as human beings. We're very wily. Our brains are very wily. We like to rationalize things. So, these are interesting koans to think about and look at how that is. But no matter what you're doing, it's still not outside of this process called the world happening. It's not outside things just as they are. Dogen Zenji, in a fascicle called Shoaku Mukusa, which means not doing wrongs, wrote an interesting thing. He said, good and evil are temporal, but time is neither good nor evil. good and evil are temporal, but time is not good or evil. Good and evil are dharmas, but dharmas are neither good nor evil. So, you know, good and evil, if we're going to use the word delusion or realization, this may be the better words, delusion and realization happen in time. They're temporal, right? They don't happen outside of temporality. And so they are within time, which means they are within a certain context. So this idea of delusion and realization happens within the context of the situation that's arising at that moment. And so in that way, it's temporal. And then, but another way that you could say this, I think would be legitimate, is to say realization and delusion are happening within the context of Buddha nature, and that Buddha nature is not in and of itself good or bad. Does that make sense to you? So the Buddha nature, or reality as it is a kind of foundational event that's going on, because it's just things as they are. So in that way, it's like that's what the foundational event is. And the rest of this is still part of that event. And I think last time I talked about it, like kind of like there's a foundational event and it sort of like sits on top of it, but it doesn't sit on top of it. It is it as well. So they're not separate from each other. It's tough. I think it's hard to talk about this from a non-dualistic point of view, which is what this is. So it's not this or that. It just is the nature of this thing called our world functioning and happening. So there is in some schools of Buddhism, they had the same question about the nature of delusion. And so they said, nope. They said, if there are people who do not have Buddha nature in these schools of Buddhism. So all of these questions and kinds of things that we grapple with, other people grapple with as well. And there are different schools of Buddhism, and they're doctrinally different as well. And but the kind of genesis of this kind of teaching is that originally in some of the schools, or in schools, the idea was that Buddha nature was acquired over lifetimes of practice. So you'd somehow Buddha nature was something that after a certain length of many lifetimes that you had practiced, you would acquire this thing called Buddha nature. And that there were some folks who were called Achantakas who absolutely never, ever, ever got this. And those folks went to the Avicii hells, and they were, deplorables. They could not possibly ever achieve a Buddha nature. So they were, condemned to these Buddhist hells for eternity. In 4th century China, there was a monk named Dao Sheng, and he had read this sutra called the Mahaparinirvana Sutra. And so in the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, according to his understanding of having read it, so this would have been in 5th century China, he read the first translation into Chinese, which was in 418, and he felt like from reading this sutra, this translation of about half of it, because fairly long sutra, he decided that the sutra was saying that all beings are Buddha nature, that if there's no such thing as Achantakas, and you don't have to have many, many, many lifetimes. This was considered to be an heretical teaching. And so he was drummed down of the monk corps, if you will. And so he left where he was, and he went back to where he had started his training in a monastic home in Lushan in China. But then in the second half of the sutra, so that happened in 428. A few years later, the second half of the sutra was translated. And when the second half was translated, it said very emphatically that all beings have Buddha nature, that there's no such thing as Ichantakas. Well, so at that point, he was brought out of exile and reinstated in his order. And he's famous for having had this insight, clearly, because otherwise we wouldn't know his name and we wouldn't be talking about him. So this sutra, the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, which there's his last name is Bloom. I can't remember his first name right now. The BDK translations, he's translated the first volume of the Nirvana Sutra, which I've read parts of, and it's pretty entertaining, but it was a hugely sutra that impacted all of East Asian Buddhism. And so now in East Asian Buddhism, which would be like Korea, Japan, there is that no one, it's all Buddha nature in Zen. So there's no notion of this idea of Chantaka that exists. What persisted after that was a Chinese school of Yogacara in which they still continue to believe in the Chantaka. I was trying to see if this school of Yogacara still exists, and I don't know. But I do have a friend who was a Tibetan nun. She's dead now, Anipama. And Anipama was saying that she thought that Buddha nature was something that was acquired over time. So it could be, I'm not sure about this because I'm not a Tibetan scholar, but there might be some Tibetan schools where that's part of their teaching. So anyway, but our teaching is that all beings have Buddha nature, is what the Parinirvana Sutra said. And then Dogen in Busho famously interpreted this as all beings are Buddha nature. So that was kind of Dogen's take on this, that he added to this. So this is very much a mainstream doctrine in our school of Buddhism. So again, I wanted to talk about this because you can see how these doctrinal landing places, we say that, you can see how other people were like asking this question too. They were saying, well, okay, if there's Buddha nature, where does delusion fit into this? For some reason, people never ask themselves, where does enlightenment fit into this? It's always, where does delusion fit into this? Because like delusion is bad, therefore it cannot be part of the nature of Buddha, right? But Buddha nature is describing a process. Buddha nature, and that process, as we incorporate and see and practice and respond from that understanding of this interconnection between all beings and all those other things, it's like, what comes out of that? What comes out of that is compassion. Why are we empathic with somebody else? We're empathic because we know what it's like to have that experience, right? And how do we know what that's like? It's because we all share that experience in some way or another. And so even if, I think, if you're in delusion, you still share that experience. You just don't understand that other people are having that experience too. But for most of us, that's, empathy arises. And the more we see this happening, the more our compassion. So compassion, of course, means passion with, right? Compassion with. And so we develop this empathy for each other. And so that's where wisdom, which is, understanding this and compassion, come forward. And the Tibetans usually say, and out of that comes skillful means. So that's out of that's going to become skillful activity. Let's see. So I'm hoping that you're understanding that this delusion cannot be outside of Buddha nature. And here's another quote from Dogen. And these quotes are tough because Dogen's trying to express something that is a difficult concept. And he says in Uji, being time, he says, although the views the ordinary unenlightened person now holds and conditions that cause them are what the unenlightened person sees. Okay, so when we are caught in delusion, this ordinary unenlightened person, when we see when we're caught in delusion, we have certain views that are caused, that are what the unenlightened person sees. And then he says, it is not the unenlightened person's dharma. It is not the unenlightened person's dharma. It is only the dharma temporarily causing them to see it that way. Okay, so that's kind of like, what? Okay, so it's not the unenlightened person's dharma. In other words, the unenlightened dharma, if you think of dharma as Buddha nature, which it is, so that means that is not outside that person's dharma or that person's Buddha nature, but it is still Buddha nature that's temporarily causing him to see that way, because it has to be, because it's not outside of Buddha nature itself. Are you guys with me? Does that make sense?
You try it one more time.
Okay. If everything is Buddha nature, then it means that if you are in delusion, Buddha nature has to be part of the reason why you're in delusion. So if we're thinking of Buddha nature as being causal conditions, let's just take causal conditions. If everything is causally related and that's part of Buddha nature, then your delusion is probably causally related, which is not outside the context of Buddha nature. Therefore, it is Buddha nature causing you to have delusional responses. And Dogen talks about this as being temporary, right? So there is this positive notion that you can escape this delusion as you understand the Dharma or understand Buddha nature. The more you understand, then the least likely you are to get caught by delusion. Are you with me? So that's the logic of what he's saying here in Uji. So he's in some ways, he's very, I think people miss this about Dogen. He's actually very positive. His teachings are quite positive. But because he's trying to express something like that is really difficult, we don't usually catch the last part of the sentence, temporarily causing them to see that way. We're just caught in, what in the world does this other part mean? But there's this sense of you, and this is an important piece of understanding this teaching, which means we are not trapped. We are not trapped. If something has no inherent existence, it means that your delusion has no inherent existence. It means that all of the things that we're caught in that we think of as being negative, that there is the possibility for transformation to happen. Because if that were not so, if things were not impermanent, if things were inherently existing, we could not escape from the kleshas that plague us, our neuroses, or however you want to call it. But thankfully, things are impermanent. They do not have inherent existence, and that we can not get caught by the things that we are caught by, or that we can get uncaught by the things that we are caught by. So that's a very positive thinking. So because of the way our minds work, I think what goes along with this teaching is that we have to have faith. We have to have faith that this teaching is true. So that when we find ourselves having a kind of black and white thinking, that we can say, it's only the Dharma making me think this way. I'm thinking about Shijin saying, the Dharma made me do it, and the Dharma can help me get out of this. Dogen says, he says in another fascal, it could be Inmo, but I don't think so. He says, you use the ground to get up off to the ground. If you fall down, you use the ground to push yourself up off the ground. This ground is the ground of reality itself. This is things just as they are. So if we fall down, it's the very practice. It's in a way, it's very much like what he said about, the Dharma causing you to think this way. You fall down, but you have to use the practice to push yourself up again. So there's this reality itself, to push oneself up again, up, even though one is already reality itself, manifesting itself, still one needs reality itself in order to push itself up from reality itself, which is causing oneself to think this way. So it is this thing that we use, this dharma that we use, and we have to have faith in that, because when we find ourselves saying to ourselves, oh yeah, I heard this talk the other day about delusion as part of Buddha nature, but it sure doesn't feel like it's part of Buddha nature. So, how do I relate to this person who's doing something that's super unskillful? And I hear this talk that says to me, well, but they are Buddha nature. And you say, well, they don't feel Buddha nature to me. I feel like I'm suffering. I feel like I'm being, attacked. I feel like I'm whatever it might be. And then, you say, well, they are also Buddha nature. Like, how does that work? Now, remember, these states are not necessarily, we are not necessarily manifesting our Buddha-ness, right? When we're caught in delusion, it doesn't take away our Buddha nature, but it does mean that we may not be manifesting and expressing that at that time. So that's an important piece. And it's important that we remember that about somebody else, right? Because the generosity that we appreciate when people extend to us at that time, we also hope that we can extend to somebody else at that time. Does that make sense? And that we don't concretize them and their personalities and say, well, they're always this way, or they're that, they're whatever it is. Because we don't like it when it happens to us. And unfortunately, we do it to ourselves as well. So we have to remember that we are no inherently existing self. So we are not always this or always that, which is something that we can get caught on. Okay, so the last thing I want to say is I looked up Trungpa Rinpoche and Buddha nature, because about basic goodness, and I was so curious about the basic goodness where he came up with that. And basically, he said that he came up with that because he felt like Westerners were too critical of themselves and too critical of other things. And so he decided that he was going to call this process or whatever basic goodness, so that we could be less critical of Buddha, less critical of our lives and more generous towards each other. So that was why he came up with the phrase basic goodness. Because my understanding is that from when I've used this phrase in the past, some of you have said, like, well, how does this word good, basic goodness, fit into delusion in relationship to Buddha nature? And so Trungpa Rinpoche decided that instead of talking about, I'm sure he talked about Buddha nature, but instead of, always talking about Buddha nature in this way, he said, okay, I'm going to call this basic goodness, because it's going to help Westerners understand that, get out of their critical mindset, because we tend to have a very critical mindset. So that was why he was calling it that. Thank you very much.